The man is a monolith, carved from the very granite of the Absarica Mountains that claw at the sky behind his homestead. He moves with the deliberate, unhurried grace of a grizzly bear, his shoulders wide enough to block the sun, and his presence so immense it seems to consume the very air in the small town of Black Creek. His name is Silas Blackwood, and for 10 years, he has been a creature of quiet legend and profound solitude. He rides into town for supplies once a season, his face a mask of indifference under a wide-brimmed hat, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, and he speaks only when necessary. Every matchmaking mother, every hopeful widow, every giggling girl has tried and failed to chip away at his stone facade. He turns them all down not with cruelty, but with an unnerving finality, a simple shake of his massive head that closes all doors. He is, they whisper, a man destined to be the sole resident of his own lonely kingdom. Until she arrives. She appears not with a hopeful flutter of eyelashes or a freshly baked pie, but on the back of a tired-looking mule, her face smudged with the dust of a long road. She is not a girl, but not quite a woman, with a spine made of iron and eyes that hold no illusions. She finds his remote cabin, a place most people couldn't locate with a map and a prayer, and waits on his porch until his hulking form blots out the setting sun. He stops dead, his hand on the axe handle at his belt, suspicion hardening his features. She doesn't flinch. Instead, she rises, smooths her worn dress, and looks him square in the eye. Her voice is clear, steady, and devoid of coquetry. "Mr. Blackwood," she says, her tone as practical as a hammer striking a nail. "I've heard you intend to grow old alone. I am offering you an alternative. You can have a wife, or you can have your solitude. You cannot have both any longer. You have until I finish this canteen of water to decide. Well, that's one way to meet. Before these two figure each other out, tell us, what's the most unexpected way you've met someone important? Share your story in the comments. And if you love a surprising romance, hit that like button." She lifts the metal canteen to her lips, and the sound of her swallowing is the only noise in the vast, empty wilderness. Silas stands frozen, a statue of disbelief. He's faced down wolves, blizzards, and bandits, but no one has ever confronted him with such audacious, unvarnished simplicity. She isn't asking for his heart, his affection, or his fortune, which is good, because he has little of the latter and believes the former turned to dust years ago. She is presenting him with a choice, a blunt force proposition that is as absurd as it is intriguing. He watches the slow tilt of the canteen, the line of her throat as she drinks, and for the first time in a decade, the silence of his life feels less like peace and more like a crushing weight. The canteen is lowered. Her eyes, clear and waiting, pin him in place. And with a low grunt that felt like bedrock shifting deep within his chest, his life, and hers, were irrevocably changed. He hadn't said yes. He hadn't said no. He had merely gestured with his chin toward the small, dusty bunkhouse he used for storage. "You can sleep there. We'll talk at sunrise." It was a dismissal, but it was not a rejection, and Alara, for that was her name, knew the difference. She had spent a lifetime learning the fine gradients between tolerance and refusal. The bunkhouse was cold, smelling of old leather and dried herbs. There was a simple cot, a threadbare blanket, and a single crate for a table. To Alara, it was a palace. It had 4 walls and a door that locked from the inside. She had come from a place with neither. She slept a dreamless, exhausted sleep, the first truly safe sleep she'd had in months. Silas, however, did not sleep. He sat in his hand-hewn chair by the cold hearth, a rifle across his lap, and stared into the darkness. The woman, Alara, was a disruption. His life was a carefully constructed fortress built upon routine and silence. He rose before the sun, worked his small herd of cattle, mended fences, chopped wood, and fell into his bed too tired to think, too weary to remember. It was a good life because it was an empty one, devoid of the potential for pain that came with letting someone in. He'd learned that lesson with a cruelty that had scoured him hollow. He still saw them sometimes in the shimmer of summer heat or the swirl of winter snow. His Sarah, her laugh like wind chimes, and little Sam, his hands so small in Silas's own. The fever had taken them both in the space of a single week, leaving him with nothing but a sprawling, hateful silence. He had retreated into it, embraced it, and made it his armor. Now, this stranger with the steady eyes was offering to tear it all down with a simple, transactional question. Why for solo? It was the language of a cattle deal, not a courtship. And that, he admitted grimly to the shadows, was the only reason he hadn't sent her packing on the spot. She wasn't offering love. She was offering a solution to a problem he hadn't allowed himself to name. Loneliness. At dawn, he found her already awake, splitting kindling with a small hatchet she must have carried in her saddlebag. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. She wasn't built for heavy labor. She was wiry and small-boned, but she was efficient. She didn't look up until he was a few feet away. "I'll earn my keep," she said, preempting his questions. "I can cook, clean, mend. I can tend a garden, milk a cow, and I can shoot straight enough to keep predators from the chickens you ought to have." He grunted. "I don't have chickens." "We'll get some," she replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He crossed his arms, a gesture that made his chest seem as broad as a barn door. "Why me? There are 100 men between here and Cheyenne who'd take a wife." Her gaze didn't waver. "Because they want a blushing bride. They want a woman who will swoon and defer. I am not that woman. And you," she said, her eyes sweeping over his isolated homestead, his formidable size, his reputation for solitude, "are not a man who wants a swooning woman. You are a man who wants to be left alone. I can do that better than anyone. I can be a presence that is also an absence. A wife in name, a partner in labor. It is a better bargain than you will find anywhere else." Her logic was as sharp and cold as a winter morning. She wasn't wrong. He was stared at in town, pitted by the women and mocked by the men for his self-imposed exile. They saw a giant wasting away. They didn't understand he was preserving what little he had left. "There's a man," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "Sheriff Barlow, in Laramie. He was my guardian after my parents passed. He sees me as his property. He intends to marry me. I chose to find my own husband instead." The way she said it left no doubt as to what kind of man Barlow was. She was not just seeking a home. She was fleeing a cage. That settled it. Silas had no love for sheriffs who saw the law as their personal property, or men who saw women the same way. It offended a deep, primal sense of justice buried beneath his grief. "All right," he said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "The arrangement stands. You will have your own room. You will have my protection. In return, you will manage the house. We are partners in this, nothing more." "A deal," she confirmed, her expression unreadable. She offered a small, work-roughened hand. He hesitated for a moment before his own massive, calloused hand enveloped hers. Her grip was firm. It was the sealing of a contract, as formal and unromantic as the sale of a bull. And yet, as he released her hand, he felt a strange, unsettling flicker in the frozen landscape of his heart. Their first month was a silent dance of mutual avoidance. They moved around each other in the small cabin, their lives overlapping only at mealtimes, which were eaten with the clink of forks on tin plates as the only conversation. Alara was true to her word. She was a ghost in his house, a quiet force of order. The cabin, once merely a shelter, slowly began to feel like a home. The dust vanished. The scent of baking bread replaced the stale air. She mended the tears in his shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She planted a small garden behind the house, her small frame bent over the soil for hours. Silas watched her from a distance, a knot of confusion tightening in his chest. He had agreed to a laborer, a housekeeper. He had not expected this quiet competence, this fierce dedication to creating life and order in his barren world. He found himself leaving a bucket of fresh water near her garden in the evenings, or ensuring the woodbox by the stove was always full before he went to his own bed. They were small, unspoken gestures, messages sent across a silent divide. The first crack in his armor came during a late spring storm. A bolt of lightning struck an old pine near the barn, and the resulting fire threatened to consume the whole structure, along with their winter hay supply. Silas rushed out into the driving rain, beating at the flames with a wet horse blanket, the heat searing his face. He was a force of nature himself, a single man against an inferno. He was so focused he didn't realize Alara was right beside him until she thrust a second blanket into his hands, her face grim and determined, her hair plastered to her skull by the deluge. Together, they fought the fire, moving with an instinctual, synchronized rhythm. They were no longer a man and a woman sharing a roof. They were a team, a single unit fighting for their shared survival. When the last ember was finally extinguished, they stood panting in the mud and ash, soaked to the bone, the smell of burnt pine thick in the air. He turned to look at her, really look at her, for the first time. The rain had washed the constant weariness from her face, revealing the sharp, intelligent lines of her cheekbones, the unwavering strength in her jaw. A deep gash on her forearm, which she'd gotten from a falling branch, was bleeding freely, but she paid it no mind. Without a word, Silas ripped a strip of cloth from his own wet shirt and gently took her arm. His touch was clumsy, his fingers thick and unaccustomed to such delicate work, but he carefully cleaned the wound and bound it. She stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on his face, her breath catching in her throat. In the gray, storm-battered light, he saw something in her gaze that wasn't part of their bargain. It looked a lot like trust. He felt his own carefully constructed walls tremble. The trip to Black Creek a week later was a necessity. They needed supplies to repair the barn. As they walked down the town's main street, Silas felt the familiar weight of eyes on him. But this time, the stares were different. They weren't just for him. They were for the small, quiet woman walking beside him. Whispers followed them like flies. "That's her," a woman muttered from the porch of the general store. "The one who just showed up. Blackwood finally bought himself a wife." Silas's hand clenched into a fist. He felt a hot, unfamiliar surge of protective anger. Before he could speak, Jedediah Kane, a local rancher with a mean streak and a loud mouth, stepped in front of them, blocking their path. Well, Blackwood," Kane sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Alara's feet. "Heard you got yourself some company. Didn't think you had it in you. How much she cost you?" The world seemed to shrink to the space between the three of them. Alara went rigid, her face paling, but her chin stayed high. Silas took a slow step forward, placing himself between Kane and Alara. His shadow fell over the smaller man, a sudden eclipse. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep underground. "She is my wife, Kane," he said, the words tasting strange and powerful. "And you will show her respect, or I will teach you the meaning of the word." Kane, for all his bluster, was no fool. He saw the cold promise in Silas's eyes and took a hasty step back, muttering something under his breath before disappearing into the saloon. The whispers on the street died down, replaced by a stunned silence. Silas turned, his jaw tight, and found Alara looking up at him, her eyes wide with a complex mix of shock, fear, and something else, something that looked dangerously like gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was part of the deal," he grunted, refusing to meet her gaze. "My protection." But as they gathered their supplies and left town, he knew it was a lie. What he had felt wasn't duty. It was rage. A primal, possessive fury at the thought of anyone insulting or harming her. The deal was changing, the lines blurring, and the fortress around his heart was beginning to crumble, brick by painful brick. The weeks that followed were charged with a new, unspoken tension. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with things unsaid. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her posture, the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating on a task. She, in turn, learned the difference between his gruff, tired silence and his thoughtful, contented quiet. One evening, she found him staring at the empty space on the mantelpiece where a photograph had once stood. He didn't have to tell her. She knew. "It's all right to miss them," she said softly from the doorway. "It doesn't make you weak." He flinched, turning to face her, his defenses snapping back into place. "You don't know anything about it." "I know what it is to be the only one left," she replied, her voice steady. "My parents died in a wagon accident. I was 12. I know the quiet." He stared at her, seeing for the first time not just a capable partner, but a fellow survivor, another soul who understood the geography of loss. The admission cost her something. He could see it in the tightening of her hands. That night, for the first time, he didn't feel so alone in his grief. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a rider. He wasn't a local. He was a deputy from Laramie, his badge gleaming in the harsh midday sun. He dismounted, his eyes sweeping over the homestead with an air of dismissive authority. "I'm looking for a woman," the deputy said, his gaze landing on Alara, who had frozen by the woodpile. "Alara Vance, ward of Sheriff Amos Barlow. He's concerned for her welfare." Silas moved to stand in front of her, his body a solid wall. "There's no one here by that name. This is Alara Blackwood, my wife." The deputy smirked. "Is that so? Funny, the sheriff holds a marriage contract, signed and sealed. Says she's promised to him. Says you're harboring a runaway. That's a serious crime, Blackwood." Alara's face was ashen. This was it. The past she had run from had finally caught up to them. Silas felt a cold dread mix with the hot burn of anger. A contract. Barlow had trapped her in ink and paper. "She's my wife," Silas repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "This is my land. You have no authority here without a warrant from the circuit judge. Now get off my property before you find yourself walking back to Laramie." The deputy hesitated, eyeing Silas's sheer size and the unyielding certainty in his stance. He wasn't armed for a real fight, just for intimidation. With a final, venomous look at Alara, he mounted his horse. "The sheriff ain't gonna like this. He'll be back, and he'll bring the law with him." As the rider disappeared, Alara finally let out a shuddering breath. She looked at Silas, her eyes filled with despair. "I have to leave," she said, her voice breaking. "I've brought this down on you. He'll ruin you." "No," Silas said, the word an anchor in the storm. He took a step closer, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "He will not. We made a deal. My protection. This is more than protection, Silas. This is his obsession. He will not stop." She finally told him everything. The way Barlow's guardianship had twisted into a suffocating possessiveness, his cold hands, his threats, the legal papers he'd forced her to sign, making her his ward until she became his wife. She had been a prisoner waiting for her sentence to begin. He listened, his expression growing darker with every word. When she finished, a tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek, he reached out, his thumb rough against her skin, and wiped it away. It was the first time he had touched her with anything resembling tenderness. "Then our deal is not enough," he said, his gaze intense and clear. "A contract can be broken by another contract. A promise can be broken by a bigger one. He is paper. We will have a vow." She stared at him, confused. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the circuit judge is in Black Creek tomorrow. Barlow thinks he's coming to claim his property. He'll find a wedding instead." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't part of the bargain. This was something else entirely. A real marriage, a public declaration, a line in the sand from which there was no retreat. It was a risk that could cost him everything: his ranch, his freedom, his life. "You would do that?" she whispered. "Why?" He looked at her, and for the first time, the storm in his eyes calmed, replaced by a fierce, startling clarity. The ghost of Sarah and Sam would always be with him, a part of his soul, but they were the past. Alara was the present. She was the bread baking in his oven, the neat stitches in his shirt, the ally who fought fire by his side. She was the one who had walked into his fortress of solitude and, without even trying, had made it a home again. "Because a man who doesn't protect his own," Silas said, his voice raw with an emotion he couldn't name, "is a man who's already dead. I've had enough of being dead." He held out his hand, not to seal a deal, but to offer a partnership that went far beyond labor and protection. "Wife?" he asked, turning her own question back on her, but this time it wasn't a proposition. It was a plea. She looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his rugged, earnest face, and placed her hand in his. "Husband," she answered. The main street of Black Creek was bustling when they rode in the next morning. The circuit judge, a stern-faced man named Peterson, was holding court in the general store. News of the deputy's visit to Silas's ranch had spread like wildfire. The town was buzzing with anticipation, eager to witness the confrontation between the reclusive giant and the powerful sheriff from Laramie. They were halfway to the store when a small posse clattered down the street, led by a man with a silver badge and cold, proprietary eyes. Sheriff Barlow was impeccably dressed, his face a mask of smug authority. He brought his horse to a halt, blocking their path. "Blackwood," Barlow said, his voice dripping with condescension. He ignored Silas and fixed his gaze on Alara. "My dear Alara, this foolishness has gone on long enough. Come now. You will not be punished too severely for your little adventure. Alara flinched, instinctively moving closer to Silas. Silas dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, placing himself squarely between her and the sheriff. She is not going anywhere with you, Barlow. Barlow laughed, a short, ugly sound. She is my ward. I have the papers right here. Judge Peterson will see them, and he will return my property to me. You are interfering with the law. He gestured to his deputies, who began to dismount, their hands resting near their pistols. The townsfolk, who had been watching from the boardwalks, fell silent. This was more than gossip now. It was a showdown. She is not your property, Silas stated, his voice ringing with a power no one in Black Creek had ever heard from him. She is my intended wife. We are here to see the judge about a marriage license. Barlow's face contorted with rage. A sham. A desperate ploy. She is mine. He spurred his horse forward, reaching down as if to grab Alara from the saddle. But before Silas could react, Alara found her voice. No. The word was a cry of defiance that cut through the tension. She slid off her mule and stepped out from behind Silas, her small frame trembling but her eyes blazing with fire. I am not yours. I will never be yours. She turned to the crowd, to the stern-faced judge who had just stepped onto the porch of the store to see what the commotion was about. This man, she said, pointing a shaking finger at Barlow, kept me as a prisoner. He called it guardianship, but it was slavery. He wanted to own me, not marry me. I ran from him to find a life, not to be a possession. Her words, raw and honest, hung in the dusty air. The townspeople looked from the terrified but resolute young woman to the furious, red-faced sheriff. They saw the truth. Barlow, realizing he was losing control, lunged for her. You ungrateful wench. I'll teach you. He never finished the sentence. Silas's hand shot out, grabbing Barlow's arm in a grip of pure iron. With a single, effortless motion, he lifted the sheriff clean out of his saddle and deposited him in the dirt. Barlow's deputies drew their weapons, but stopped as Silas turned his cold, furious gaze on them. It was a silent, lethal promise. Judge Peterson, Silas said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of an avalanche. My bride-to-be and I are here to be wed. If there is any law in this territory that says a woman cannot choose her own husband, then the law is wrong. Judge Peterson stared at the scene, the humiliated sheriff sputtering in the dust, the defiant woman standing tall, and the giant of a man who was ready to tear down the town to protect her. He stroked his beard, a slow smile touching his lips. He'd seen his share of frontier justice, and this felt more just than anything written in his law books. The law, the judge declared, his voice booming across the street, also says a man cannot be forced into a marriage against her will. It seems to me the lady has made her choice. He looked at Silas and Alara. The fee for a marriage is $2. Do you have it? Silas reached into his pocket, never taking his eyes off Barlow, and produced $2 silver. He pressed them into Alara's hand. She walked up the steps and gave them to the judge. Right there, on the porch of the general store, with the whole of Black Creek as their witness and a fuming sheriff as their uninvited guest, Judge Peterson performed the ceremony. The words were simple, the vows direct. When he pronounced them man and wife, a quiet cheer went up from the crowd. Silas turned to Alara. She was no longer his partner in labor, his tenant, his contractual responsibility. She was his wife. He reached out and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes shining with unshed tears of relief and a profound, overwhelming emotion that mirrored the one finally breaking free in his own chest. The deal was done, but the marriage was just beginning. They rode back to the homestead not in silence, but in a shared quietude that was warm and full of promise. The cabin, when they reached it, seemed different. It was no longer his shelter or her refuge. It was their home. That evening, they ate their meal not as two solitary people sharing a table, but as a family of two. After they had cleaned up, he found her standing on the porch, looking out at the mountains bathed in the soft alpenglow. He came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. I never thought, she began, her voice soft. I never thought I'd have this. A choice. A home. He looked down at her, at the strength and resilience that had brought her to his door. She had come seeking a bargain, an escape. She had offered him a life raft, and in doing so, had saved him from drowning in his own solitude. "You asked me once," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Wife or grow old solo?" She turned to face him, a small smile playing on her lips. "I did. It was never a choice," he confessed, his heart aching with a decade of unspoken truth. "I was already old. You made me young again." He reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and for the first time, their touch wasn't about a deal, or comfort, or protection. It was a promise, spoken without a single word, under the vast and watchful western sky. He was no longer Silas Blackwood, the lonely giant of the mountains. He was simply a husband, standing beside his wife, finally home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.